So before I share my screen, I've really got two aspects of sharing the screen I'll do. So the first is interpreting. I've got an information sheet I'll email to Dean and he can email it to your group, which I think hopefully is fairly simple, and it's probably the basis of my talk on a simple way of interpreting, choosing the right guidelines, having a look at each of the criteria, pH, exchangeable cations, and then your micronutrients and all the rest. So that's separate to the talk, and that'll be emailed out to you by Dean straight after this, if that's okay. A little bit of background. I've been in regen ag, bioag for about 30 years. I love it. Yes, people get very scared of chemistry, soil chemistry. I need to really reassure everyone, you cannot get the soil biology functioning without looking at your chemistry. It's just such a big ask, and I worked a lot with Elaine Ingham, Soil Food Web and that sort of thing. And even at the end, I was getting her convinced that you actually do need to get your chemistry right to some extent. But the soil biology is all about taking the emphasis off the chemistry. But if you don't have nutrients there to start with, you're behind the 8 ball. So you need to look at that. We've got a new Regen Ag degree at the university that started this year at Southern Cross University, and we've got 150 students, which is fantastic, huge success, and it's just going strong. And our university is really pushing that angle, and the students are loving it as well. So getting the science behind Regen Ag, and the science is all about carbon. So the more carbon you can concentrate on and building up your carbon, that's building up your biology and building up your chemistry. All right, so I'll just share with one screen first. So basically, I'll flick through that. That's what I'll email around. It's just got some basic guideline steps here, 3 steps: picking the guideline, looking at soluble totals, macro, micronutrients, and then a little bit on the calculations to work out the differences. In that, I've got a agricultural understanding the soil results, some notes there, color-coded back to the report. And then there's an example report there with guidelines for heavy, medium, light and sandy soil, and then an example of just a miscellaneous oats sample that someone sent in and comparing it back to the medium guideline. And I'll go through that in more detail now, but you can see it all through there. A few more notes that are at the bottom of the report, and I'll email that to Dean. Or I'll go on to the presentation now. All right, so basically, like I said, involved with Soil Food Web, Elaine, and many other biological pioneers. Biological and carbon farming, it's just about having less dependence on inorganic fertilisers. In some cases, you still do need it. You do need to replace nutrients, and I'll be talking about that through the presentation. Do a lot of work with soil care in this region, northern New South Wales. Soil health card, there's all these sort of things around dig, look, smell, feel, really get involved with your soils and understand them. And one of the best ways is digging a hole and a shallow hole and looking at them. So it's good when you can do your own soil collection. And on our website, we have information on there how to do your own soil collection. I don't know how much detail we'll go into today, but traditional soil testing is 0 to 10 centimetres for pasture, veggies, that sort of thing. For tree crops, 0 to 15 centimetres, and that's where you scrape off your organic matter and take the soil under that. For the carbon work, the CSIRO did all the work on 0 to 30 centimetres. So some of your soil tests may be at 0 to 30 centimetres. That will dilute your nutrients to some extent compared to the 0 to 10 to 0 to 15 centimetres, and something we just need to be aware of. Trying to understand that difference. We don't really have guidelines that cover 0 to 30 centimetres, but I really think the future of testing with carbon, if the carbon is going to be at 30 centimetres, I think it's going to move towards nutrients at 30 centimetre. But it really upsets the traditionalists of agronomists because they really can't get their head around it.
So Graham, all the testing that we've done, with the exception of those who joined the program a little bit later, which was like Jess and a couple of who've done their own soil testing, all the others, there's 13 that we did in the year 1 of the program. They all came through your lab, and we did them all based on the federal government's soil carbon testing methodology, namely down to 30 centimetres and down to a metre. And the two tests that most people had done was the obviously the soil organic carbon component, because that was certainly a requirement from everybody, but also the Albert Reams, which is the standard agronomy test, which is what you're referring to at the beginning. So just know that that's the background that everybody has, and I sent you a few examples of those along the way. So that's typical of.
Yeah, I wasn't sure on that, so that's good to clarify that. And yeah, I'll be mentioning that all the way through for this talk. And then there's other sort of concepts of visual soil assessment. And really, it's just putting the dependency back onto chemistry, biology, and soil physics. And that's your compaction or structure of your soil, and that's very important as well. Oh, absolutely important, essential. Now, look, many of you have probably seen the soil food web. It's actually just a biology, ecology type trophic levels of consumerism. One eats another and eats another. To me, I look at this as nutrient cycling. And what we're doing in the chemistry side of things is seeing what nutrients you have stored in your soil, in your organic matter, and then looking at what the availability of those nutrients are through the profile. And if you've got a good active biological system, you're really releasing a lot of those stored up and bound nutrients, which is so important for sustainability and regen ag. So why test soil? Yeah, there's a lot of people that don't do it, but you really need to know what nutrients you're lacking. It's that old story about you're limited by your lacking. And if you've got plenty of nitrogen, phosphorus, but you've really got no zinc, copper or boron, you're really limiting your production. And if you can increase your production, you're increasing your profits. And yeah, it's really just getting these things right. Determine excessive nutrients. There's certain nutrients that when they're excessive, they will cause problems, balance problems in your soil. They'll cause excessive weeds and excessive diseases, and nitrate's a big one there. If I could really get rid of urea to a large extent in agriculture, a lot of our problems would be better. Urea in small amounts, fine, but once you're getting higher levels, you're in real problems and a lot of disease issues. Assess nutrient balance. So you've got to balance out your cations, and I'll be talking about that in more detail, and other nutrients as well. You really don't want to have highs and lows. You want to try to balance it through related to your soil type. And I'll talk about relating to your soil type in more detail, and then back to your 30 centimetres, which we're talking about. Relate chemistry. When I've been down Victoria doing presentations and that, often you can look at your soil structure and compaction issues and all the rest, and it often can be related to your calcium-magnesium ratio. And the whole structure of the soil, if it's not functioning, then it's hard to get your chemistry functioning. So you do have to be so aware of compaction, but your chemistry can lead to compaction issues as well. And what I'm saying there is really high magnesium to calcium ratios and high magnesium soils are very prone to compaction issues and infiltration issues and even waterlogging issues. Directly target fertilizers or compost applications. So there's a lot of people now that with compost, they're actually putting on value-added compost. So if your property is low in calcium, they're adding lime into the compost. If you're low in phosphorus, they're adding rock phosphate into the compost. I'm doing a lot of biochar work these days, and for holding on to the nutrients in compost, they're adding biochar. I mean, the industry has come so far forward for regenerative ag and biological ag. All these things are just helping farmers to really hold on to nutrients and be the most efficient they can with the production of nutrients and using the nutrients.
Graham, can I
yeah.
just, this is terrific, and just to let you know in terms of how we've structured our program, because I think that might be useful in terms of setting a context. So I'll just, if you can give me 30 seconds, I'll just quickly sort of outline that. So the soil component is really important, and we did some work on that last year and looking at plant biology and soil biology, but it was like a quick toe in the water. And we know that can go forever, of course, there's no end to it, as you just alluded to. Then we've got multi-species cover cropping trials and demonstrations, and that's going to be more intense this year. We've got grass and pasture inventory. We've got holistic grazing and demonstrations around that. Then we've got the dung beetles and establishing nurseries for those. And then we've got revegetation, planting, shelter belts, hydrology, and lastly, at the end of this year's program is a whole section on soil amendments and biochar. Okay, so your word mention of the word biochar, which I think is fantastic that you're doing that, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it. I think that is very relevant to those on the call right now, because we will get a lot more exposure to that. So thanks for that.
And every part of those programs you just mentioned, I'm fully supporting. I mean, dung beetles are amazing. They are just another macrofauna that's aerating the soils. There's so many other macrofaunas out there we don't look at, but dung beetles is a great start. So yeah, and look, I'm on the biochar committee, so we've been developing the standards for quality control on biochar. So, and that's a whole new thing. I won't drag on too much. So soil testing is current nutrient status of your soils. Leaf testing is another one you haven't looked at there, and that's really looking at nutrient cycling and access to nutrients, and really assessing problem solving if you've got any issues there. So I won't go into leaf testing anymore today. This I won't go into in a big way. Traditional soil testing really just looks at exchangeable nutrients and soluble nutrients. There is another thing we won't talk about a lot today. It's total nutrients. Nutrients. It's in our RA Pack 002. Did you look at total nutrients, Dean? I did pull up those results you sent, but I haven't had a chance to sort of go through them.
Where would I see that, Graham?
I'll just pull up on the phone. I should be able to just pull up some of the results you sent through. As you go down through, they're black coded in the results.
Yeah, I've got total carbon nitrogen and carbon nitrogen ratio. That's black. That's all we've got. That's black.
So we didn't actually do the totals. It's just looking at another thing, which is this pool, looking at your total phosphorus, your total potassium, calcium, iron, manganese. There's about 20 odd elements that we look at for totals. It's not essential. It's just looking at this bigger pool.
Yeah.
And that's what you also have access to when you're really accessing or generating that biology, soil biology. You're starting to get this nutrient biological release here. But look, exchangeable nutrients are things we really need to look at, and your soluble nutrients for plant productivity. It's just to be aware there's this other store. And it's very much, you can't change it. It's basis of your soil and your mineralogy in your region. But it is this other store of nutrients. So you don't need to know it, but it's just something good to know that there's a backup or a safety net for your nutrients out there as well.
Right.
Even when we look at our totals, Elaine Ingham's a big pusher of this. The actual mineralogy of your soils, we don't even get with an acid digest. And often people say, well, really, what is my soil made up of? I'm not going to hammer on this one as well, but you'll get a copy of all these slides. I'll send them as a PDF to Dean, so you can come back through to any of this. XRF is actually an X-ray of your soil, and the biggest constituent is your soil is oxygen, and then silicon, aluminium, and iron. So I get all these people concerned about really high iron and aluminium in their composts, or really high iron and aluminium in their soils. In your total store, that's your mineralogy. That's what's actually there. You don't need to worry about it. So it's all the availability of those, whether it's a problem. And your iron and aluminium do become toxic when your pH drops below about 5. And that's why you really need to concentrate on getting your soil pH correct. You don't need to get it at 7. You just really need to get it a bit higher. You can look into your exchangeable aluminium to see if you've got a problem there. And I'll go through that in more detail soon. But just don't panic about these things, but look at oxygen. All your minerals in your soil are oxygen. They're effectively an iron oxide, a manganese oxide, an aluminium oxide, and it's basically a mineralogy. But it shows that oxygen is the thing that feeds your biology, and you must have oxygen. So if you've got waterlogging in your soils or compaction issues, you've got this major problem with oxygen. So just be aware of that. And you can see the other elements there as an estimate. Interpreting soil tests. Look, my priority is not NPK. If you had no soil biology, yes, you just look at your NPK, and there's still so many agronomists that will do that. They're only one small part of it. Your pH, get that right first, adjust that. Organic matter, really try to get that up. And some of the reports Dean sent through, you're only looking at 1 or 2% organic matter. So there's so much more scope to build that up, and that's in your guideline as well, to try to get that up.
Graham, when you say there's so much more scope, can you elaborate that on a little bit, please?
Look, in our deficient inland soils in New South Wales, we're looking at maybe 0.5% organic matter. But those soils historically, when they were formed and when they had native vegetation, were maybe 2 to 5%. Not huge levels, but a hell of a lot greater than 0.5%. In really successful organic farms and regenerative farming, there's nothing stopping you getting above 5%. I've seen plenty of farms with a grub above 10% organic matter. Organic matter is a calculation from organic carbon or total carbon, and I can go into that more detail in a moment, but it's a calculation of 1.7. It's a theoretical, but it's pretty close working out your organic matter. And I'll mention that more when I go through it. But yeah, it really means when you get your organic matter, you do less cultivation, which burns off your organic matter, direct drilling, that sort of thing. Get rid of your erosion if you can, which washes away your organic matter. Get your biology activated, which converts your organic mulch and organic matter that's visible in your soil down to a non-visible carbon, humic acid, fulvic acid, and all the rest. So it's such a complex field, organic matter. But just be aware it's not visible. We sieve the soils for agriculture and then in the carbon monitoring and the carbon analysis through 2 millimetre. Now, 2 millimetre is pretty fine. So all those roots you think of and the leaves and whatever else you see in your soil, that's not part of this organic matter measurement. It's all the less than 2 millimetre fraction. So just be really clear on that. So going through, your conductivity is your salt level in your soil, and you really want to make sure that's not high. Your cations are called exchangeable cations, called cation exchange capacity or effective cation exchange capacity, a very complex field, but it's exchangeable levels of your calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, hydrogen, and aluminium. And I'll go into that more detail. Phosphorus, there's hundreds of different phosphorus tests in soil, and we concentrate on a few: Bray 1, Morgan as your soluble, Bray 1, Bray 2, Colwell, and your agronomists just get habit by using different ones. They all mean something different, but you don't need to use all of them, just be aware of them. And I'll go through that in a moment. Your trace elements: boron, zinc, copper, manganese, iron. Silicon's getting more and more popular these days, and molybdenum. Your nitrate and ammonia, there's a lot of labs that don't even look at your ammonia, but a lot of those elements, there's a whole lot of chemical and biological reactions that can convert one to the other. So without looking at, if you've got really low nitrate, but you've got some elevated ammonia, then you can have biological processes converting that into readily available nitrate. Total nitrogen is an undervalued characteristics of soil, and most soils have a very consistent carbon-nitrogen ratio. And there's guidelines on that. If you have very low nitrogen, total nitrogen, then that has implications as well for conversion through to nitrate and ammonia. So another thing to look at. Total nutrients, I've already mentioned that, and that's your soil textural characteristics. So I've mentioned this interpretation and the guidelines that Dean will send around shortly. The concept of these are general guidelines based on soil type: heavy, medium, light, and sandy. Whereas type is determined by texture and cation exchange capacity. And I'll go through with more explanation there. So your cation exchange capacity effectively determines whether it's a sandy soil, a light, a medium, or a heavy. And this is based on a basic cation saturation ratio concept. In regenerative agriculture, biological agriculture, we don't want you to get bogged down in your chemistry and panic. So what I generally say, this is a whole nother concept in agriculture of the SLAN, sufficiency level. And what that goes through is, as long as you've got sort of towards your sandy soil of nutrients in your soil, so that lower level guideline, that end column, which I'll go through in more moment, then realistically, you've got enough there to grow a crop. You've got enough there for your soils to function, and then you can start accessing your biology and getting the whole system moving. It's probably getting it down to a level where it is at your lower level, so you want to really be looking at adding your compost, which will bring in these nutrients. Now, a lot of all compost have all these nutrients, has a fantastic variety of nutrients to bring into and build up your levels of nutrients and stocks of nutrients in your soils. I won't talk about compost too much today, but obviously I'm a massive supporter of that. And biochar is just another level of compost, a different aspect of compost. So you can see there, effectively that's the top part of your report. And the reason I call it, I've divided up our report into 4 parts. This is our soluble reams or soluble nutrients. And they're just something you can look at, and it's got guidelines here. I'll explain in a moment which guideline you pick, but you can relate 2 different random soils here, an oats and a landscape supplier, which obviously is landscape's a lot higher there. You can then relate it to a particular guideline here to see whether you're high, low, or indifferent. The first sort of, well, sorry, I won't do that one again. And yeah, you can see here, you can see your pH, and then you've got a guideline of 6.3. I was saying before, as long as it's greater than 5.5 to 6. Once you get down to under 5, you're definitely starting to look at other issues there. Your conductivity, yep.
Sorry, you're on the second bottom row, aren't you? Where pH is in there.
Yep. Can you see my mouse there?
No, we can't. I can't anyway. I don't know. Can others see?
I would have thought you can see my mouse, but
can't see the mouse.
No, don't assume we. Yes, best perhaps if you describe where
pH. It's the third from the bottom of there. So we can go down. You've got your exchangeable Morgan, your soluble Morgan, calcium, magnesium, potassium, and phosphorus. Don't take a lot of emphasis on your soluble Morgan phosphorus. It's really designed in America, and our soils are so iron and aluminium rich, they really lock up that soluble phosphorus, which is probably good for leaching. You hear about a lot of tests called phosphorus buffer index, phosphorus absorption capacity. All they're really showing is that our soils love locking up phosphorus. And really the phosphorus you put in, superphosphate or whatever else, it locks it up very readily. And that's with a big advantage of biological farming, regenerative farming, to get your biology activated to start unlocking some of that locked up phosphorus. You've then got 3 tests there. Over the left there, you can see Bray 1, Colwell, and Bray 2. Really, your Bray 1 is your available phosphorus, and your Colwell and Bray 2 are more of your locked up phosphorus. So you can see they're often quite a bit higher. I won't go into the details of that, but you have some general guidelines there to show whether you've got enough phosphorus in your soil. In both these cases, really in the oats, it's getting a little bit low. In your other landscape soil there, there's plenty there. You definitely wouldn't want to be adding any more. Nitrate and ammonia, obviously in your landscape there, it's very low nitrate, but as I said, you can have some conversion if you've got biological activity to convert ammonia, nitrogen into nitrate. Sulfur, really extremely low there for your oats. So that's one of your deficiencies there I was talking about. To me, that just says you've really got to get some sulfate on there. Now you can get on some gypsum or mag sulfate. There's a whole lot of approved things for organic farming, regenerative farming, to build up your sulfate. But if you add a good compost, that will build up your sulfate as well. But you can see there, it's quite deficient. Your pH is third from the bottom, is where I'm sitting there now, and then your conductivity, which is your salt level.
Excuse me, Graham, with the conductivity, the units seem to change between each soil report. So what I've got conductivity of 1500. How does that relate to DS/M?
That would be 1500 microsiemens per centimetre.
Rightio.
20 units, decisiemens is the 1 DS per M. Now 1500, you've got to divide it by 1,000. So that would be 1.5.
Okay.
It's still extremely high. You're actually indicating to be a fair bit of problem there.
Yep. That's in the groundwater, in the bore water. Yep.
Yeah. So that's
okay. Thank you.
So you do have problems there. Once you do find you've got elevated conductivity, you go to the next part of the report. Before I go there, estimated organic matter. So like I said, it's a calculation, and we have in there the methods. Lest we have a lot of information on our reports, and that's why I probably need to do these more regularly. Your organic matter is your percent carbon times 1.75. Then you can see here your oats has 1.5% organic matter. Your landscape soil, which obviously had a lot of organic matter, is 5.2. So, sorry, question there?
Graham, yeah. Out of the 13 tests from last year, and I was hoping that if I could actually have my screen visible, I could show you, a quick scan of those all on the page. The average soil organic matter was round about 2. Some went down to perhaps 1.5, the lowest 1.8 was quite common, 2.4. And then there was a 1 at 3, I think 1 at 5, and I think Graham, who just spoke then, had the highest at 6, which was really a bit of a standout. So I'm not sure, Graham, exactly what part of your farm that Tom did that sampling, but that was remarkably high from my observation.
Well, that's excellent. And look, there is no limit. I do put the greater than sign there now, because I had people that were saying, oh, wow, I've got to 4.5% organic matter now, or 5, I can stop. Really just keep building it up. It just helps the aeration of your soil, and helps your long-term sustainability. So it's a slow process. It's not going to happen overnight. And
why do so many people have this view that there's a limit to how much carbon you can hold in your soil and it will just stop? That's one view. We had a talk the other day from people from AgVic who were talking about the amount of soil carbon it takes 1,000 years to build a centimetre of soil. And maybe from a mineralisation of rock perspective, that may be true, but we know in biological systems that's completely not true. We could do it very, very fast. So there seems to be sort of fixed views on these things, which become really irritating when you're talking to people who just want to learn.
Yeah.
These differing bits of information from so-called experts.
Yeah. And look, I'm the biggest critic of experts. I'm no expert. I've been in this gear a long time. I do not fully understand biology. I do know there's no limit to carbon. I've seen soils that are 10 to 15 to 20% carbon and functioning beautifully. But I do let people have their views. I don't sit there and try to challenge anyone. If they think there's a limit to carbon, it doesn't stop me telling people to stop, to increase their carbon and to keep working on getting it higher. People like Christine Jones will show you they've increased carbon 1 to 2 to 3% down to a metre. Now that is extremely hard to do. Mara Seeds in our local region, Stuart Larson, fantastic. Go out to his property and he's getting his carbon up to 8 to 10% carbon. And he's only on the cup. I mean, his rainfall's like 200 or 300 millimetres a year out of Ranganey here. So it's not dependent on rainfall. It can be done. And I know in his property, when we dig down to 2 metres, we were getting roots of his oats crops going down and barley down to 2 metres.
Yeah.
So you will build up your carbon because your roots is often transferring your carbon through the profile.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So look, I'm not going to pretend for 1 second this is a simple topic. It's extremely complex. So I'm just really giving you a touch on it today. And you will get a totally different talk from another so-called expert. But yeah, I'm not an expert. Look, this is the next start I've divided our results into. It's a very important one. Exchangeable cations, extremely complex. And really, without a mouse, it makes it a little bit harder, but you've got a method over the left. You don't need to worry about that. It's called exchangeable cations. You've got calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, aluminium, hydrogen. You've got 3 different units for each lot there, and that's because everyone wants to work in different units. You can pick one of those units and just look at that number if you can zero down on it. Your centimoles per kilogram, also called milliequivalents per 100 grams, if anyone's familiar with other units. They're interchangeable, the same thing. then that converts with a conversion to kilograms per hectare or another conversion into milligrams per kilogram. So you don't need to worry about those units. You can just pick one of them to how you look at it. In our cation exchange capacity, we effectively pick the centimole per kilogram. So in that first soil, 5.95. If we add on, that's for calcium, if we add on the magnesium at 1.99, we add on the potassium at 2.31, and we add on the sodium at 0.07, 0.01 for aluminium and 0 for hydrogen, that'll come to 10.33. That's your effective cation exchange capacity. That's where that number comes from. It's just a calculation, a summation of each of your exchangeable cations. Does that make sense?
That's terrific, yeah.
It's very simple. You can sit there with a calculator now and do it, and you'll see there that all comes at.
Brilliant.
All right. So it's simple there to look at. Now, the next part is called base saturation. And all that is simply taking, say, for calcium, your 5.95, divide it by your total exchangeable cations, which is 10.33, times it by 100, which is converting it to a percent.
Hey, can you just say that again, please, just slowly? So you take your 5.95.
5.95 divided by 10.33.
Okay, yep, got it.
Times it by 100, which converts it to a percent. So it's putting it's ratioing out your exchangeable cations compared to your total, your summation, which is your effective cation exchange capacity. So effectively, a clay soil has a much higher summation of cations than a sandy soil. So you can see there, you've got 10.33 oats. If you look across, it's sitting between a medium soil and a light soil with 10.33. And then that landscape soil, it's 23.66, which is sitting above a heavy soil. Note some of the really black prairie soils have up to 100 cation exchange capacity. 5 times that heavy. We don't have guidelines for it. All we know is those soils are loaded in nutrients and exchangeable cations, huge ability to store nutrients, very poor ability to release it. And that's where in those really black soils, you don't need to worry too much about your chemistry apart from getting your biology to access those nutrients.
Okay. So that of course invites further questions, doesn't it, that last statement?
It does. It creates a whole lot of, if you've got those sort of soils, which I don't think you have any of in your area, it's a whole nother story on looking at your deficiencies. Even in those black soils, you'll have some elements that are just totally deficient. But you need to build up those, but you don't need to worry about your calcium, your magnesium, your phosphorus often. It's just you've got to get your biology activated and functioning. So you can see the ratio there. If you start looking now at your exchangeable base saturation, your calcium, it's suggesting percentage of around 70%. And I've got a little bit more on this. Your magnesium is suggesting around about 10 to 20% based on soil type. And then other levels there. If you've got elevated conductivity in your soil or in your water, irrigation water or bore water, and in your conductivity reading, the one I mentioned just previously, then you need to look into this exchangeable sodium to see whether you're going to have a sodicity issue in your soil. And that'll hugely affect productivity and your longevity. So keep an eye on your bore waters, your irrigation waters, your effluent reuse if you're doing that. And you really want to start measuring and looking at your exchangeable sodium, your percent exchangeable sodium percentage, ESP. On the left there, base saturation, sodium, which is actually interchangeably called your exchangeable sodium percentage.
So that links back to the previous page where you had conductivity there, does it?
Yep. So if you've got elevated conductivity, your conductivity is really just your conductive of your soil. And then to see whether you could have elevated conductivity because you're using a compost with high sulfate or high nitrate or high ammonia or high phosphate, because all of those things will affect your conductivity. But most likely it's your sodium chloride. And this is how you see whether that's elevated by looking at your sodium. All right. Okay. Now, in a moment, I'm going to go into this in more detail, but I want to mention it now. All these soil tests are effectively 15 centimetres. These guidelines are effectively 15 centimetres. I've already mentioned that when you're looking at your soils, you're looking at 30 centimetres, which is diluting your nutrients. So to be more descriptive of it, if I was looking at this oat soil, it has 10.33 effective cation exchange capacity. It's effectively between a clay and a loam. Because you've diluted your nutrients by taking a greater profile, I'll be looking right back towards your light to sandy soil for that. Once again, for your landscape as 23, generally you'd take your heavy soil because it's up there. Because you've diluted your profile by a factor of 2 nearly, I'd be looking more towards your medium soil as the guideline you're looking at to see whether you have sufficient nutrients. So because you've diluted it to some extent, I think generally just step back a guideline level. Don't have as much expectation on your nutrients because we've diluted them. Now, the ulterior argument to that is it's more realistic because your soils do not grow in your top 10 to 15 centimetres. Your plants, sorry. They really, your soil functions in that 30 centimetre profile. All site specific. When I was over in London a few years back talking about agronomy, I was talking about depth, and then I went out in the paddock and they had pure lime. Well, their geology was carbonate, and under about 15 centimetres, they did not have soil. It was just a lime shelf. So all horses for courses, but I don't know how they do their carbon monitoring over there. They could only do it in 15 centimetres. In certain areas of England, obviously, different areas, different soils. All right, I'll move on to the third part. That's the sort of second part. The third part is getting down towards your micronutrients, your zinc, your manganese, your iron, your copper, boron, silicon. How do you build up silicon? Diatomaceous earths, organic matters, not many traditional, but there's some silica sprays now these days if you feel that's a deficiency in your profile. So here, once again, all you're doing is directly comparing your number. In this case, zinc is looking very deficient, or is very deficient in your oats, but fine in your landscape soil at 0.9, and then you bring it back to a guideline level. And like I was saying, for your oats is somewhere between medium and light, but in your case, because you're taking your 30 centimetre profile, I'll be taking it back towards your light and your sandy. And here for the oats, I'm saying zinc's deficient, manganese pretty fine, iron no problem, copper a little bit low, nothing to panic about, boron a little bit low, nothing to panic about, silicon fine, and then we start moving on to your carbon. Now, there's two types of carbon we look at. Total carbon is typically in your general agronomy reports. With your carbon credits, we actually need to look at total organic carbon, which is just often a little bit lower than your total carbon, not hugely. And that really just takes away your carbonates. Your lime that may have been added to your soil, that's a carbonate carbon, which is not your organic carbon, and any geological type carbonate minerals in there. So we need to treat the soil with an acid to remove carbonates, and then you end up with a total organic carbon. But like I say, often total organic carbon and total carbon are quite interchangeable.
So is that like removing any lime that you might have put on the paddock?
Yep. Yeah. Be aware of lime. Don't get fooled by it. The lime is CaCO3, calcium carbonate. Your molecular weight of your carbon with getting in some chemistry is 12, and effectively lime is only 12% carbon.
Yeah.
It's majority 40% calcium and a whole lot of oxygen. It's only 12% carbon, so it's not a big error. So don't get people telling you, oh, you can't do it because lime is a massive error. It's not. It's 12% in its constituent. And there's not normally that much you put on to be a major influencer. But so, yeah, your total carbon's in all our soil reports, and it's a very important measure of your estimate of your organic matter, and then you have your total nitrogen. Now, your total nitrogen, I could go on to this for hours, is 0.1% for your oats there. 0.1% is actually, you've got to times a percent by 10,000 to get milligrams per kilogram. So that's actually conversion of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram of organic nitrogen. Your soil biology can access that and convert it into nitrate and ammonia. So often in agriculture, in regenerative and organic, they're saying, well, we're not adding lots of urea. We don't have a lot of nitrate. How the hell's our crops growing? Are they getting the nitrogen from the air? It's possible, but you've got a massive store of organic nitrogen as long as you've got organic matter there. Typically in a healthy soil, you have around a 10 to 12 to 1 ratio of carbon and nitrogen. In a non-healthy soil, you don't have that ratio. So as long as you're building up your organic matter, you're building up your organic nitrogen and creating another source for your biology to access to create nitrate and ammonia. So hence then in a regenerative organic farming, if you can get your organic matter up, you then don't need to worry so much about your nitrate and ammonia. When your agronomists are telling you, oh, look, your nitrate's critical and you're going to fail, you can say, actually, I've got good organic nitrogen because I've got good organic carbon.
Graham, can I just make a comment on that and tell me if I'm missing the boat here? And I'm just referring back to listening to Christine Jones and so on, and where she talks about the difference between organic carbon, inorganic carbon, organic nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen, organic phosphorus, inorganic phosphorus, and so on, all the way through. And I get a sense that that's not always clear in people's minds what the difference is and what the microbial response is. So if you have inorganic nitrogen in the form of urea and you put that onto your soil, it actually needs energy to break that apart, and it's taking that energy from your organic component or the carbon, which then depletes that carbon store in order to free up the nitrogen into a form that it can use. Is that correct or not?
Yeah, no, that's a good explanation. There's so many different ways of looking at it. Your problem with a lot of your inorganic sources, they're ions, NO3, NH4, that sort of thing. They're very leachable. Yeah. You do not need huge levels of them. So why would we have to throw heaps of urea on? I don't know. It washes out of the profile. It volatilizes. So it's just basically a waste as well, not only consuming that carbon energy. Yeah, there's so many other ways of sourcing it. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, look, it's difficult. We have a basic description there, clay loam, clay, and that's really just a really estimate on giving you some idea on what your soil type is, but really you should know that information. It's not up for us. It's just something we have there to give you a little bit more information. Chloride estimate is just based on your conductivity to give you some idea there on what your chloride estimate is. It's your conductivity times 680 and your conductivity in that unit. So it's just, instead of doing a separate chloride test, you can get some idea on whether your chloride may be elevated there. I will keep going. The next slide I have is your total nutrients. You've just got your total carbon, nitrogen, but that's if you get the totals. And there's also another option here with that RA Pack 003 for a few extra dollars to look at your contaminants. Now, if you've been applying biosolids, effluent, any sort of remediation or anything, you might want to look at that in future. And you don't need to look at it once, just to make sure you don't have elevated lead, arsenic. It's amazing how many soils. This oats paddock was loaded in arsenic. Now, I don't think that's healthy for eating organic oats. When I was in London, I went through a very rich person's property, and I found out their property was loaded in lead, and he'd been eating the strawberries like there's no tomorrow. It may not be a huge problem, but it's a good thing to know. But you can see there, in a lot of soils, we have loaded phosphorus. Phosphorus is there sort of highlighted about 6 lines down. Your oat soil is actually really deficient in total phosphorus, but this landscape soil has 4,258. So that's when I start looking at total nutrients, start saying, well, you really need to build up. You can get similar information from your exchangeable and soluble, but you don't get understanding of what your reserves are. So that's there. So I won't dwell on that anymore. I do have another 15 odd more slides, which is a bit of a worry because I actually have another serious meeting at 12:30, so I'm going to run out of time here. But we can follow this up at another month's meeting or something like that.
Sure.
So these are guidelines. I won't go through it too much. You'll get these copies. That's on your report. In our interpretation, we have this colour coding to what I've just said now. You can actually get it from some of this information I've had, which is on our reports as well, and on that information sheet that will be sent around. Colour coding back to what you're dealing with. What I was saying before, the first part is really selecting this appropriate guide. So we base that on your effective cation exchange. If it's around 20, then it's a heavy soil. Around 14, it's a medium soil. Around 7, and you pick one of these columns. But like I was saying, because you took your 30 centimetre profile, jump it back one. So if your soil's around a 14, aim for this sort of column, the light soil. And that's really just the nature of what you've done there. It's not perfect, but it's you don't need to be perfect on the chemistry because you're trying to depend on the biology. All right. So, and your basic texture and colour or texture there may help you determine whether you're a light soil, sandy or medium. Also, generally, when agronomists talk, they look at this proportion of cations, and that's without looking at your guidelines. You want your exchangeable, your base saturations to be around 65 to 80% calcium, around 10 to 15% magnesium, 1 to 5% potassium, 0 to 1% sodium, and less than 5% aluminium. So, and that's written in literature or historically. And any soil report, you can look at that and say that you want to have that sort of goal. Just puts the emphasis back on your calcium. Very hard when you've got really high magnesium soils to get that ratio. You've sort of just stuck with it, and that's when you really got to concentrate on your organic matter. Also, your exchangeable calcium magnesium ratio. I haven't concentrated on that yet much, but I've talked about soil physics, compaction, and all that. And that's really what you want to look at, your calcium magnesium ratio. And it's, I'm going to step back one step on your calcium magnesium ratio to show you what it is. It's your calcium to magnesium ratio is hiding down here. I sort of failed to mention it. It's actually just taking your calcium as milliequivalents divided by your magnesium as milliequivalents, and you can see there it's like 6 and 2, so your ratio is 3. It must be taken in that unit. Don't let agronomists or anyone else use a different unit. It must be taken in that unit, the unit that determines your effective cation exchange capacity. And yeah, when you ratio them out, you end up as 3. All right, and then then you can go to this little table I've given you here and simply look and say ratio less than 1, calcium deficient, 1 to 4, calcium low, 4 to 6, balanced, 6 to 10, magnesium low, and greater than 10, magnesium deficient. So there's a simple way of just looking at one little number and determining what your soil is and what you may need to do in the future.
Where's that summary you just provided then, Graham? Is that on your other notes or?
No, it's actually just in this presentation, which I'll be sending you.
Okay.
No, it's got a reference there as well, but yeah, it's commonly used. Soil acidity, alkalinity, obviously if it's less than 7, it's acidic soil. If it's greater than 7 pH, it's alkaline soil. And that's just the nature of what you're dealing with. pH is a measure of your hydrogen ions. I say they're desirable, 6 to 6.5 in water. I won't go into too much details on calcium chloride pH. It's about 1 unit lower than water pH. So it's making it sound like more of a serious issue if it's lower in calcium chloride, but it's just a different measurement.
Do you use water mainly, I know?
I think all Australia has now adopted water as routine. Calcium chloride is another optional extra, but yeah, water is sufficient. And that's your pH of your soil. We take 1 handful of soil and 5 parts of water, and we mix that for an hour, and that's how we determine that. And that's also used for your conductivity. pH influences your nutrient availability, toxicity, influences biological activity. Biological activity does not like really acidic soils. So that's what I mean. You're up against it. And you raise that pH with lime, dolomite, and organic matter. I've got a published paper that, well, it's sort of published in some areas, but it's a bit controversial, where they talk about how you can raise your pH and you buffer your resilience of your soil just with organic matter. And there's some fantastic case studies where they've built up their pH when they had some serious pH problems. They couldn't get it built up with lime. They needed to use a good compost to build that up. Soil nutrition. Alan Coates is local agronomist here with macadamia farms, and I deal with him a lot. And we're just basically a lab, but he gives me information here, and I work with him on building up soils. And he's saying, look, feed the soil, not the tree. So that's sort of related to that soil type. You really want to build your nutrients up to your soil type, and then your tree accesses those nutrients. You balance your soil nutrients. You supply nutrients to grow crop. More nutrients stored in clay, soil and sand, so related to those guidelines. If you try to put too much nutrients in a sand type soil, it just does not have enough cation exchange to hold on to it. So it just leaches away, you're wasting your money. Annual nutrient applications may last a couple of seasons, and really a lot of your biological fertilisers, your rock phosphates and all that will stay in your soil for a long time. And your organic matter binds up a lot of nutrients as well. And you can have a role for nutrient removal data. It's important to know that if you're doing a heavy crop rotational, sugarcane farmers up northern Queensland where they're doing 2 crops a year, you are removing a lot of potassium in those cases. If you know the nutrient removal data, you can have some realisation that you do need to add organic fertilisers back in, preferably in a compost or something. But it's good to understand that. I wouldn't calculate it directly, but it gives you an indication on what you need to replace. Nutrient application system, soil applied nutrients, soluble slow release, fertigation, obviously compost, animal manures. Always good with animal manures to let them age first in a paddock for maybe 12 months to release a lot of that ammonia that can be quite toxic, or mix it with a good compost and once again let it age. Mulch will break down on a good, very active, organic, biologically active soil. I've seen mulch break down in 3 months. So it's still another organic source. And anything's a mulch, any carbon source.
Graham,
yep.
Quick one. With animal manure and like cattle, dung and sheep and so on, does it degrade over time? Like, you know, it might be sitting in the paddock. If you've got dung beetles, that's great. They'll bury it pretty quickly. But if not, it might just be sitting there unless you harrow it, just as a cow pat that dries off. But, you know, they won't normally eat the grass around it because it's too rich in nitrogen, I think. But, you know, does that degrade, or does it hold its value?
I think it degrades, but it actually just changes. It volatilizes a lot of its toxic ammonia, sulfides, which is your rod and egg gas smell. And yeah, I think it changes and matures. If you can mix it with some mulch or something to give it a carbon source and to really balance out that nitrogen to some extent, I think it'll be better for it. If you can get any sort of carbon source, because it's just a fully high nitrogen source. Its calcium magnesium ratio is way out of the planet. And that's why you really don't want to be shoving it directly onto your property. You really got to give it that aging process to try to balance out some of its biology and its carbon nitrogen ratio.
Thank you.
So foliar fertilizers, and then obviously you can't knock any of this kelp, fish, molasses, humic acids. Don't go overboard with it, but it's just another tool that may help get that nutrient cycling and activate your biology. I mean, compost teas, compost leachates, all these things are just other tools that may help get your property underway. But if you've got everything functioning, you shouldn't need to go to that extent. Be very careful with your kelp and your fish. You're not adding too much salt. A small amount's fine, but if you've got a salinity problem already, keep away from those. Molasses just activates your bacteria, but not your fungi, typically. So you've got to be careful of that. Mineral and disease control. I mean, nutrients of a plant to a large degree determine its resistance or susceptibility to disease. I know there's a lot of people sprouting that if you do have a deficiency of silica, you do then are more prone to disease because it's an element that seems to be building up the structure of leaves and the structure of plants. Calcium critical. If you've got a deficiency of calcium, we'll often see pests come through and wipe out something that's really deficient of calcium. It doesn't have that structural support. Potassium's important to keep up. Obviously, all your elements there, your micronutrients, they're all building your disease resistance as well. But then you've got your excess nitrogen. I'll actually add in sulfate there. Excess sulfate will actually add to your disease and pest pressures. And yeah, it's a lot of evidence out there. Soil balance, structure, compaction, root area. Look at your roots of your plants. You'll see where they've got compaction issues. Moisture availability, nutrient loss, disease. It's all about your soil structure. Soil biology, influence on root health, nutrient cycling, nutrient retention, disease, and moisture. Soil nutrients should be available and balanced. So you want to have a proportion available. You don't want all your nutrients soluble and exchangeable. You want a balance in the soil. If it's really high soluble, which I mentioned in the first part of that table, if that's too high, that means you're just going to lose it in the next rainfall. So you don't want that overly high, you don't want it overly low. So it's all about balance. Determine nutrient inputs, aim for desirable levels, adjust pH and calcium levels first, add compost at required rates, use soil tests to determine nutrient inputs. So an agronomist will sit there on a spreadsheet or a calculator or a software package and just match those levels you have in your soil to a particular guideline, one of those 4 guidelines, and tell you directly how much calcium, phosphorus you may need to add. But like I say, in the biological world, you don't have to be that critical. You can just see where you're low and high and add a small amount and see what change you get by your plants. Soil nutrients should be available, balance. Apply nutrients to desirable plant growth stages. So you've got to be aware of growth stages, and the agronomists will look after that for you generally. I'm not an expert in that area. I'll keep moving there. A couple of slides to go. Really just, I won't go into this. Big compost-wise, to balance of organic materials. The whole composting process is a massive biological magnificent chemical combination of biological reaction. It burns off carbon when you make compost. The microbes burn carbon. They love it. They consume it, produce CO2, but that's this respiration. That's the nature of all Earth, all planet, all function. Anaerobic, I'm not a great fan of, but there's a lot of fans of anaerobic respiration, which is your anaerobic compost. They do produce ethanol, so you can be very careful with your anaerobic to let it dissipate and burn off that ethanol before you put it on your plants. Otherwise, there's a lot of fans and a lot of processes with that. Generally, compost rates, Alan Coates I mentioned, he says for poor soil health and organic matter, he recommends 50 cubic metre per hectare per year, basically. For fair soil health and organic matter, 20 to 30 cubic metres per hectare. And then good, he still recommended base load of 8 to 10 cubic metres. So obviously that's very costly. So if you can produce it yourself, and anyone can produce compost, it's just taking any waste materials from your neighbours, yourself, work with your neighbours if you've got a few close neighbours, and have a neutral zone of compost production and share all your different materials. Diversity is the key to compost. You do not want the same products all the time, and you do need to try to balance your carbon to nitrogen ratio. Your benefits of compost are massive. Long-term increases, I won't go any further really. Liming benefit, which I've talked about, improved biology yield, improved crop yields, improved water holding capacity. Health issues, I got into soils benefits because if you get a healthy soil, you actually get a healthy waterway around it. You're decomposing your organic matter. You bind up toxic elements and pathogens and pesticides, which is a big thing. So don't worry about testing the soil if you've got a good organic carbon and biology. Just really build up all these. And a balance exists between optimum soil nutrients for plant growth and nutrient runoff. You do not want to have it too high. You're just wasting your money, and you're environmentally damaging your waterways, your groundwater, your reef, whatever else. So really, you've got to get that right. And that's just a ram through. I've got about 8 minutes left before I've got to go into another seminar or a meeting. So I'll unshare my show.
Graham, it's Felicity here. Grant has asked a question. Can you talk a bit more about calcium-magnesium ratio and soil structure compaction?
Yes, basically, look, you're a bit trapped. I've stopped sharing that now. Basically, if you've got too much magnesium, you're more prone to compaction. And really, when you're getting around the 1 calcium magnesium ratio, you've got some serious issues there. When I've pushed down probes down to a metre depth and I find there's a big compaction zone, I've done testing at that metre depth and found the magnesium to be a lot higher. So it's something you're not going to solve overnight. If you've really got high magnesium soils, it's really just going to be something you're just going to have to manage. You cannot add enough lime to change that magnesium calcium ratio, calcium magnesium. So really, I think your solution there is compost, organic matter, alternative ways to looking at it. So you've acknowledged the problem. Hey, I'm going to have a compaction issue. Let's reduce tractor use in that area, or try to look at just tractors going on paths, whatever, or set areas so you're only minimising your compaction not right under your root zone, and then looking at getting your organic matter and your biology functioning to alleviate that problem that you inherit in your soils. Is that enough?
And what about green manure compost? Any comments on that?
Oh, look, great. It does a thing, but it also actually has a nitrogen drawdown impact. So you have to be careful with it. It will suck the readily available nitrogen out of your soil. Any immature type compost, organic matter, anything that's immature, that hasn't fully aged, and some of your green manures, when you push them back in again, you're trying to plant again with another crop. I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm aware that it has a nitrogen drawdown impact. It'll suck the nitrogen the plants then can't get.
So that includes, if you have a multi-species cover crop, you grow it, you graze it with the cattle, and it grows again, and then you plough that back in as a green manure, you know.
You've got a time period. I think you've got to wait till you want to, if you want to start getting your plants working again, or you're replanting, because it has that delay that it does have that nitrogen drawdown impact, and it means the nitrogen's being consumed by the biology, and the biology consuming that green manure, so that, yeah, you might have a deficiency there. Maybe you need to add, in that case, a small amount of urea to feed it, and I've heard of them doing this, small quantities to feed that nitrogen, so your then plants can get established, so that's not an issue.
Okay.
I'm not an expert in that area, but I believe the chemistry adds up to what I just mentioned then.
There's a question about should cattle be taken off wet paddocks to avoid puggy compaction?
Yes. I think that's just an obvious one on weights. I mean, a cattle's a big, heavy beast. Unless you've got a real spongy sort of organic soil, and if you do have a high magnesium soil and it's wet, yeah, you're going to have that issue. It's going to accentuate your problems. So, yeah, not much you can do apart from that, but, yeah, look at that.
Yeah, the solution, I think one of the solutions there is, if you've got strip grazing and electric fences, you can just not have them too long in one section of the paddock and just keep them moving. Look,
all rotation is fantastic. Yeah, all that paddock rotation. I've been to lots of seminars on that. Judy Earl around here, if you want to look up some of her work on rotation of cattle, it's just brilliant. She does excellent presentations. She's just in our local area, but everything she talks about can be applied anywhere. Yes, it's a lot more work with fences, but the work she does on that shows so much return in building up your soil carbon with cattle. It's quite phenomenal.
Okay. I guess there's probably a lot of questions, but that people can still ask it. You've got, what, how many minutes left, Graham? 5 or 3?
Yeah, 3 or 4, because I've got to sort of prepare for this other one. It's a council audit meeting for 3 hours.
Don't really want to go into that, do you?
I don't have much choice on university council here. I'm trying to help out the university, which it needs help, I tell you.
Sure. Alex, there's quite a few people on the call at the moment. There must be further questions that people have in the back of their minds in terms of, I think for a lot of people, the questions that we typically hear is, well, I've heard stuff, I've read stuff, but I still don't quite know where to start.
Easiest starting is just build up your carbon.
Yeah, so I guess I'm opening a bit of a door there if people want to respond to that just in a selfish way, because we've all got to do what works for ourselves. No comment anywhere. Graham, one thing I thought that you said towards the end there, noting that you're going to send these around, I'll at least send them when you send them to me, and there's a lot to sort of mull over. But in terms of a sequence, adjust your pH and get your calcium levels sorted as a first step, because that can have a major impact, correct? I think that's what you were indicating.
Yep.
And if you have a biologically oriented system, you don't need to be so precious about getting all those numbers exactly lined up as per the charts there, that the column sort of that range for the different soil types. So therefore going forward, because we'll all be assimilating what you've talked about, and we'll be at various actions and interventions to try and rebalance our soils. How often do you think we should actually just get in there and have apart from just observation, but knowing that observation improves over time when you know what you're looking for as well? But is this something that you would look to do on a 6-monthly basis, an annual basis, or is there times of the year which might be better than others?
I'd be looking at your crop, or what you're growing, and look at the active phases of that. I think spring's always a good time to have a look at your soils. That's when things are starting to function. Get in there early. Obviously in dead heat of summer or dead heat of winter, I wouldn't be jumping at it. Biology struggles through amazingly in our hot summers and our cold winters. It's just so resilient. So really just dig into your soils and dig into your roots. I mean, Alan Coates, I'm a great supporter of, and he'll sit in there and look into your roots, dig them up a bit, see what they're holding on to in organic matter, and what sucrose or what they're leaching out. I mean, it's such a complex field, but them getting in there and feeling it, smelling it. I mean, you can see whether you've got anoxic conditions. So it's so much you can do in that. So I'm going to have to finish now. I have just sent you those slides as a PDF. It's only 1.3 megabytes, so I've reduced the clarity down, but it should be very clear. Look, if you send me more questions on email or whatever, I'll try to get to them. I get about a couple of hundred emails a day, so it's hard to keep up with it. So if I miss you, send it again, and we can go from there.
All right, well, fantastic. Thanks very much, Graham, on behalf of everybody. And we'll look forward to reconnecting with you at some point.
All right, enjoy the rest of your meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.